Good morning. Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous. So it's very nice to see you all today. Innovation for a net zero economy. In the current context, as we heard, this is a crucial topic. With the energy and climate crisis converging, we can certainly see why innovating to meet these challenges and align the present and the future is more important than ever. This makes our first panel of the day especially relevant. We are fortunate to have Elena Cherney with us today to moderate the conversation. Elena is a coverage editor at the Wall Street Journal, overseeing network of reporters and editors in the US and bureaus around the world that cover a wide range of topics, including business, finance, the economy, and politics. She previously led the journal's energy coverage and also served as Canada bureau chief. From 2007 to 2014, Elena worked at the Globe and Mail, where she held senior roles, including editor of the Report on Business and managing editor. She's a graduate of Yale and traveled across Canada from BC to Montreal and Toronto. Thank you very much. Elena, the room is yours.
We have with us today to talk about net zero goals and innovation, Leah Lawrence, Head of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, sitting in the middle. Kikelomo Lawal at the end, EVP and Chief Legal Officer at CIBC, and Deborah Orida, Global Head of Real Assets and Chief Sustainability Officer at CPPIB. And on the screen, we have David Keith at Harvard, with many titles, actually. So I'm just going to leave it at Harvard and move on from there. So I'd like to dive right in and talk about net zero, which as a goal is being driven in large part by governments and investors who are well represented here, I think, who share a common goal of limiting climate change. Let's start by talking about how each of your organizations is playing a role in reaching this goal. Can we start, Deborah, with you describing CPPIB's net zero pledge and particularly explaining how you're going to do that without excluding investments in fossil fuel companies?
For sure. So where we start is our mandate is to maximize returns without undue risk of loss on behalf of 20 million Canadians. And so our net zero commitment is really a recognition as investors on where the world is going and what we need to do with our portfolio in order to protect the sustainability of the CPP fund. So we've made the commitment to reach net zero across all scopes, all greenhouse gases by 2050, both in our portfolio and to lead by example in our operations. And there are 4 pillars that underline that commitment. The first, as you mentioned, is the approach, which is to invest and influence the whole economy transition required by climate change rather than taking a blanket divestment approach. The second is to lead by example in working to decarbonize our own internal operations. The third is to increase the $67 billion of green and transition assets that we already have in our portfolio to at least $130 billion by 2030. And the fourth is to continue our work on the decarbonization investment approach that we announced earlier this year, at the very end of last year, where we seek to create value and generate good returns by assisting our portfolio companies and new companies in their decarbonization efforts.
So just to understand before we move on to the next panelist, if you're going to continue to invest as part of that balanced portfolio in and still reach net zero, you're going to continue to invest in fossil fuel producers and other assets. That means you must be relying pretty heavily on offsets within the portfolio.
Well, I think that what our approach is to recognize very pragmatically where the world is today and the evolution and innovation that needs to happen across the entire energy ecosystem between now and 2050. And rather than divest, which may clean up our portfolio but doesn't actually help decarbonize the world, we'd rather be investing in and influencing that transition that needs to happen.
Okay, let's come back. There's some really interesting ideas to unpack there. Deborah mentioned innovation and the role of innovation. Leah, can you tell us a little bit about how your organization views net zero goals in thinking about shaping funding decisions?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would say that we don't, and so I'll explain that. So Sustainable Development Technology Canada is the largest funder of entrepreneurs who are tackling all sustainability challenges, climate change being an important one. And so everything we look at, we're trying to figure out, is there an economic and environmental benefit that's transformative? And so, first of all, we're tech neutral because we want to get to the science and the finance that will help us understand if that's true. And so we're testing hypotheses all the time with entrepreneurs. Because, to your point, I think net zero it's an aspirational goal that, in my view, was set because it was really complicated to say we want to get to 2 degrees Celsius limit in emissions, right? And that's pretty hard for even me to say, and I've been working so a long time. So I think the idea was that if we talked about net zero, you could think about it as a corporation, you could think about it as an individual in your home, and you could think about how you might do that. But I think when we talk 2030 and 2050, sometimes I can't even decide what I'm going to do tomorrow. So I think that's the thing we need to keep in mind, is that if you look at the IEA data, what we know today, and this is what SETC does, is that probably we only know about half of the things we could do to meet the 2050 goals. And we're commercializing them as we speak, which means the other things that we have to do, the other half of things that we have to do, we don't know yet. We're going to have to experiment. We're going to be wrong sometimes. And so that's how we do it. We're looking at, okay, what could be the intermediary steps there or the long-term steps there? Can we take an investment in the short, medium, and long term? And how do we tell? And we always talk about how we're going to be wrong, so let's adjust as we go and figure that out. So our business model is to work with the entrepreneurs from seed through to scale up. And I would say, I think later hopefully we'll talk about what's our challenge. One of our challenges is we're just figuring out how to commercialize stuff and make it bigger. And that's actually where it's kind of exciting, where larger financial institutions, larger energy companies, all companies, because every sector has to transform, are getting involved, because now you're bringing in people who have that kind of experience. Entrepreneurs sometimes don't have the scale-up experience, but they have the ideas and the interest. So how do those come together?
Kikelomo, when you listen to that, what are you thinking, and how does CIBC think as a lender about both the commercialization opportunities and also net zero goals? You're part of the Net Zero Global Banking Alliance.
Yeah, no, so I would have to echo some of what's been said, especially in terms of being flexible and reacting to what's happening. At CIBC, I'd call our approach a layered one. We've sort of anchored things in our climate transition announcement that was in August. And that's got 4 pillars that's available on the website. But we add to that the announcement that we made last month with respect to our first sector-specific target. And then we think as well about the partnership for carbon accounting financials. We've partnered as well with the Rocky Mountain Institute's Center for Climate Aligned Finance. We put all of that together, and then we add as well commitments, specific commitments. So at CIBC, we've committed to $300 billion in sustainable finance activities. We've also pledged $100 million with respect to clean tech. We've got any number of people across the organization who've got either ESG as a specific mandate or at least a mindset. And I think when you add all of that together, it is a layered approach, as I say, but it is also responsive and reactive.
So David, I want to ask you, are net zero pledges the way to reduce emissions? Is this the way to get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees? What should the goals be, and what should the yardsticks be in your view?
I don't think very distant goals, and first of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I don't think setting very distant goals matters all that much. Politicians don't actually do things on those timescales. What matters is the kind of maybe 5 year by 5 year, a few year by few year political term, real actions to move things on the ground. In my view, the setting distant goals is sometimes a way to reduce political pressure and distract from what one is actually doing now.
So what would actually make a difference? Let's shift a little bit and talk about change and innovation. In your view, what are the technologies that would make a difference, and how do we, as I think one of our panelists talked about, how do we fund and commercialize these technologies and approaches?
Sure, I'll come to that. Maybe a tiny bit of context. I mean, I've worked on climate for 30 years. It is amazing how much attention there is now. That's a change. There's now more than $600 billion a year roughly flowing into clean energy worldwide. On the other hand, next year it'll be 70 years since the New York Times published a headline about how industry may change climate, reporting on some of the first good climate science. And 70 years is a long time. We've dealt with a lot of other environmental problems, and yet emissions are still going up. And you're not really seeing much in the way of emissions meaningfully changing, maybe just the beginning of it. I think it'd be very hard to imagine meeting a 2°C target with emissions cuts with the current political environment. I think that innovation is obviously crucial in developing new technologies, but I think the fundamental is governments setting clear rules that limit people's ability to use the atmosphere as a waste dump. And then industries will innovate to meet those rules. So if you think about Carbon Sharing, this company I founded, which was a thrilling ride for 13 years, and now it's 150 employees, and public companies announced they're going to spend $1 billion building our new plant. That's all great. But if you think about what drove that, I think one of the biggest things was a rule. Early on, when I was running the company and raising money, it was the fact that I could point to the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard and say, this is a rule, and under that rule, our company could actually be a successful business. And I think that it's easy to overthink about a bunch of little stuff that pushes innovation along and underthink about the fundamentals of government setting rules and then capitalism figuring out how to compete under those rules.
So what do those rules look like? Is that a price on carbon?
Yeah, the most obvious thing is a price on carbon, but I think we're never going to have the kind of, some of my colleagues at the Kennedy School seem to imagine we're going to have one single global carbon price. I think that only is going to be an econ textbook. It's going to be a big mixture of things. So carbon price, cap and trade systems, or sector by sector controls. The cement sector is often talked about as a hard to decarbonize sector. In fact, I think it's in some ways a relatively easy to decarbonize sector. It's just been politically successful in getting that idea across. It can't run away because there isn't much trade. There are existing technologies to cut emissions. I think that's a case where government applied clear rules. What would happen is the industries would cut emissions quickly, and prices for cement will go up, but that wouldn't affect buildings very much. That's just an issue of political will. And instead, government pays for a bunch of kind of innovation on the margins that, in my view, is a bit of a distraction.
I'd like to hear what the panel thinks about a carbon price. What role would a price on carbon play in helping you meet your net zero goals? Deb, can you help us with that a bit?
Sure. Maybe I'd just go back to something that David said, which is that it is about action, right? It is about what we're doing today and in the future. You can't set the net zero target and then say, I'm done. And I don't think that that's our approach. So we do need to start acting now. And we also need many actors to do things, right? So when we think about what the world would need to achieve a net zero by 2050, it's governments accelerating and supporting the commitments they've made, it's corporations, investors, and financiers changing their behavior, it's consumer behavior change, and it is and of course, technology and innovation, and finally, we do need, of course, the development of the metrics and the carbon markets in a way that allows all of us to understand and report on what we're doing.
Does that resonate if you're thinking about the investment in new technologies, clean technologies, and also the Global Banking Alliance moves rely heavily on creating a global framework. Is that something that you see happening, Kikelomo? Is that?
Certainly. So one of the things that we did last year was to join the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And I think that was important for setting global standards.
Right.
But when I think about all of the, we've talked about all of the things that are part of the considerations. You talk about public policy. We have now an inclusion in the federal budget that speaks about the growth fund. These are all things that have to contribute to solving this problem.
Is all of this made harder right now in the context of rising fossil fuel prices? There's investor interest right now. There's a great demand. The global inflationary pressures and also war in Ukraine, disruptions in gas and oil markets are creating an opportunity there for investors. Does that detract from interest in alternative investments, clean energy, and also pressure to come up with a carbon price and solutions?
I don't know that it detracts, but it certainly complicates.
Yeah.
When you think about security and thinking about how that now needs to be factored in and being even more reactive to minute-by-minute developments, I think it certainly makes things a lot more complicated. You certainly have to have a more global view of things instead of, for example, by company or by country.
I'll offer a comment, if I may.
Please.
So on the one hand, obviously higher fossil fuel prices look the same as a carbon tax. So Econ 101 says it should help. But I think that doesn't capture all that's going on. I think we face a risk in many Western democracies of kind of populist revolts against government policies on decarbonization and other things that will drive up energy prices. And so with the war driving up prices, I think there is a sense in which it actually is, in some sense, both ought to be easier, but is also actually harder to implement the kind of really strong market controls and actions you need to drive emissions down, because that will tend to drive overall energy prices higher still and risk a kind of populist backlash.
And I think it adds an element of security to the discussion that wasn't there maybe 2 years ago, 18 months ago. And in fact, last summer, I was involved with a group that published a paper on security and climate change. And so it adds this additional dimension, this additional complexity, to use your words, Kiki, that now has to be factored in. But I would agree with David, like the acceleration in focus on how a price shock can go through the economy in an instant, not an instant, but practically in terms of the number of years we've been working on this. The kinds of desire then to change supply chains and to think about how we do things differently, and the frustration maybe with the lack of information and optionality that we'd like in that environment. So, I mean, I think if disruption is or a crisis is an opportunity to think about how to do things differently and act, in that way we could be positive about, I think it will accelerate things. Yes, there are smaller movements to allow price relief for those that may be affected, and that I think is an important policy that many are going through. But at the same time, you don't see them falling away. They're just reevaluating maybe options that they had before. And I think the frustration is, and you can see this in much of the reportage, is to have real information and data about what the path steps the right way things might be. It's hard to know what's right because we just haven't thought in this way before.
Yeah. I want to go to some of these audience questions on the issue of sort of where investors put their bets, especially when there are more opportunities, more demand for fossil fuel consumption right now. I think takes us to questions around, who's going to fund the infrastructure, again, necessary for GHG reduction opportunities. This is one of the questions here. These opportunities often do not have returns, at least immediately. Efforts such as carbon capture have not been commercialized yet or don't make sense at a commercial level. How do we match the trillions in clean investment that are necessary for these projects? Where does that come from and how does that work? Do you want to try that, Deb?
I'll start, sure. So when I took over the Real Assets Department about a year and a half ago, the first thing I did was to combine our conventional energy group with our renewable energy group, because as we've been talking about, getting to a low carbon future is going to require innovation and investment across the entire energy ecosystem. And the great thing about that combined group is that it also has a mandate to invest across the types of risk-adjusted returns that we need to get to that future. So we have $8 billion of renewable investments, but it's not just sort of infrastructure investments that is inside the mandate. It spans through some of the smaller, earlier technology innovations that need to be invested in, which, by the way, we have some insight into because our portfolio companies on the other end of the spectrum are often customers of these earlier stage companies. We do some fund commitments there as well. We do growth energy investing, and so we span that full spectrum that is required to get us to that future.
And is that enough, David? I know you've done a lot of work on solar geoengineering. Is that kind of approach going to fund the sort of research and development for those innovations that are necessary in your view?
Well, solar geoengineering is a really different topic. I don't think it wants or needs commercial investment. It needs government attention and public policy attention to try and understand how it might work better and to integrate into climate policy. But to answer I'm happy to come back to that, but to answer the question on how to get these sort of trillion-dollar scale investment flows or how to make CCS happen, I will sound like a broken record, but I think this isn't complicated. It's a matter of rules. If you look what happened, say, I happen to know the numbers better for the US, partly because they're more transparent in the US. In the US Clean Air Act, at the peak, it was costing the economy close to 1% of GDP, a little bit under, which is sort of actually where we are now globally for climate flows. This is big money. And this didn't happen by a whole bunch of incentive programs. It happened by government setting a rule. You can't sell cars unless they meet this standard. You can't operate unless you meet that standard. If you don't meet it, we lock you up. That's how a huge amount of innovation happened in response to that. And I think sometimes we kind of lose sight of that basic. You're not going to have, or at least I don't want a kind of socialized world where government just kind of crony capitalism throws all this money out the door. The fundamental lever, if you're going to do something that costs several percent of GDP, which is what it would cost to decarbonize the pace we're talking about, is setting clear rules that are relatively easy to enforce, hard to cheat.
Do you want to talk a little bit about funding for the research that would be necessary to get solar geoengineering to be part of the solution?
Well, so maybe my guess is many of the audience won't. So solar geoengineering is the idea that humans might deliberately alter the Earth's radiative balance to reduce some of the risks of accumulated carbon dioxide. So in my view, it fits in as one of the four things we do about climate. Decarbonize the economy, which we have to do. Remove carbon, which reduces the long-run risk. We could do solar geoengineering and do adaptation. And for solar geoengineering, I think the central issue is about trust and confidence. So if you look at the current set of science results, there's 1,000 papers published, they would actually show that doing a moderate amount of solar geoengineering in addition to emissions cuts would give you a safer world than just doing the emissions cuts. But obviously many people don't believe that. There's a great deal of distrust. And I think what we need there are governments and not-for-profits being active in a kind of global way to do more of the research and begin the serious discussion about how it's governed. And maybe on that score, I'd say there's action. It'll be more publicly announced in a week or two, but there's a global commission standing up with a really kind of diverse global recommendation out of the Paris Peace Forum. Pascal Lemay, former head of the WTO, will run it. And that global commission will begin probably the most serious discussions yet of what governance of these technologies might look like.
So this
but I think it's very different from clean tech, where for clean tech, what we want is huge flows of money and innovation and so on. For solar geo, the issue isn't really innovation and money flows. It's cheap. The issue is the risk of doing it and who trusts who.
Okay, and I think you're making a very interesting point here that this is part of, multiple prongs that need to be taken in order to achieve ultimately 1.5 or 2%. So we started by talking about net zero and pledges, and now you're talking about a technology that could, in fact, remove carbon. Sorry, no, counteract. Yeah.
Yeah. Carbon removal,
Yeah.
of which the company that I founded, Carbon Engineering, is one of the many, many ways to do it. Carbon removal can really undo the impact of putting carbon in the atmosphere.
Right.
It's inherently expensive. There are ways in which it really could, I think, be cheaper than lots of other things we're doing. It's very exciting, but that looks more like a normal energy technology. It takes capital and money and so on. Solar geoengineering is so cheap that it appears that for a few $1 billion a year, you could stop the planet warming for a long time. But the issues are really about what the risks are and who controls it, who makes the decisions. It's quite a really different thing.
Okay, so let's go back to another couple of the prongs here. Assuming that, as we've talked about, net zero itself is one piece of things, and we do still need to talk about policy and clean technology. Let's talk for a minute about Canadian policy and Canada's approach to reaching climate goals. Are the stated policies enough to get Canada to net zero by 2050? Leah, what do you think of this?
Well, I think I would go back to the IEA prediction. We know perhaps half of the things that can get us there, and we don't know the other half. So I think to the government's credit, it has put out a pathway that it has modeled, which, lots of goals right now are aspirational. They've actually tried to model and put in place a very complex set of rules. Some of them sticks, as David has rightfully said, need to happen in terms of fuel standards and other things, and some of them incentives in terms of billions of dollars in many, many programs, which makes it a bit complicated because there's so many sometimes. But I think that really reflects their attempt to, I recognize that every sector of the economy has to fundamentally change. Every sector, not just energy. And in fact, some of the near-term things that are likely to happen and maybe have really important impact are things like investment in agriculture, both to reduce emissions and reduce fuel costs in agriculture, because this is a big security issue right now, as well as think about how we ameliorate soil and get more carbon in the soil. These are ideas that only really, David and I have been working on this for a long time. We tried it, maybe 2 decades ago. It's now in the fore again, thinking about how you could do that on a global basis. So I guess, I think what you see in federal policy is the tension of a long-term goal and trying to get drivers going in the right direction, as you said. Many actors focused on collective action that is very messy, A, and B, multi-jurisdictional challenges, which means that the delivery of a low carbon fuel standard, for example, is provincial in many ways. BC's already had one for a number of years. So, it's this tension of how do you work within existing structures and systems that were designed for a different era, and how do you transition those, and that's messy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I was just going to say, I think one of the, when we think about the pathway to net zero, one of the opportunities that sometimes gets underplayed is the opportunity for consumer behavior change. And we've made some investments that reflect some of that activity, and it's not going to be the total solution, as you said. We're going to have to do a whole bunch of things. But the opportunity to have a bit of consumer behavior change, I think, is quite promising. So, for example, one of our investments, Octopus Energy, provides data to its customers. So, for example, on your phone, you can see the wind is going to be blowing tomorrow, so it'll be cheaper to do my laundry tomorrow. And that idea of being able to shift demand, not just manage the intermittency of renewables on the supply side through batteries, is, I think, just one indication of the kind of innovation that we can drive and that can help us manage the transition to the sustainable future.
should Canada phase out fossil fuel development, extraction? Should that be a goal?
Well, I can see that for CIBC, divestment is just not, it's not our path, it's not our solution. We have a long-standing relationship with the industry. CIBC we like to say we are a relationship-oriented bank, and the relationships are important to us. We need to preserve that. We need to think about the reality of the Canadian economy. I do think, though, that we must be careful about these resources and these assets falling into the wrong hands. Those who are not going to be stewards in the way that, in a responsible way.
I'm going to ask you, David, for the last word. If fossil fuel production in Canada continues at its, let's just say, current pace, can the 2050 goals be met?
It seems extremely implausible. I can't imagine a world where it would make economic sense to produce oil at very high levels and drive emissions down that quickly. I mean, it just doesn't add up. I don't think anybody serious thinks it does. I think it's just obviously politically hard to say that out loud in Canada. I'm an Albertan. My friends depend on revenues for the oil industry, but I think if one is actually remotely serious about driving emissions down that fast, of course you're going to have a drastic fall in fossil fuel production. There may be some residual fossil fuel production for some cases, but the industry is going to be much smaller than it is now. And I think the unwillingness of Canadian politicians to say that openly and clearly reflects the hard political choices and the fact that we're, while I think Leah said it very well, there's a lot the Canadian government has really done well. We're not, as a country, actually yet shoulder to the wheel to be serious about what decarbonization would really mean. Because in a world where you're decarbonizing quickly, yeah, of course you're shutting in a bunch of those resources. I mean, this is pretty much basic math. If you want to stop the climate warming, you have to stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere. And that comes from fossil fuels, essentially all of it.
So if that's the basic math, and really the only way to meet these targets is by halting production, moving away from production in fossil fuels, do lenders and investors, looking at the longer term, need to revisit the role that these investments play in their portfolios? Do you need to divest? Deb?
I think we look at our portfolio and have for many years been incorporating ESG considerations, including climate change, into our investment decisions. And one of the things that we do is look at both on new investments and existing investments, what do the returns look like under the bookend scenarios of both the high warming and the high transition scenario, and factor that into our assessment of the risk-adjusted returns.
I hear that, and I think, Kikelomo, you also spoke to this, but can the math add up? Can you actually get to your net zero pledges and still invest in fossil fuel producers?
What we're investing in is the transition of the whole economy, including the innovation and evolution of some of the companies that you're talking about.
Fair enough. Kikelomo,
Can I jump in for?
Yeah, please.
I have lots of friends in the oil and gas industry. They're good people just like anybody else. But in general, those industries, lots of the skills in there, the EPC companies, the personal skills, the organizational skills, those are transferable to new things. But I think it is highly unlikely that those integrated companies just transform themselves to somehow be clean energy companies. That's just not the way industries have transformed themselves before. You look at the history of industrial transformations, that just doesn't happen. There's a bunch of reasons, structural, fixed cost reasons. I think it's just important to be honest about this. And that's no shame to the fossil fuel industry. We depend on fossil fuels to keep our industrial economy of the world going today. I think the central focus is not really divestment, it's about rapidly building out the alternatives so we drive the fossil fuel market down.
These are very, very complicated issues. Do you want to respond again?
I just wanted to do one response,
Please.
David, which is that we've had very successful investments, like our investment in Wolf Midstream, which is an example of the kind of transformation that can occur, and the management team that we partner there using their project management skills, their technical expertise to do carbon capture. They have first mover advantage as a result of building the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, and now are capturing opportunities to do carbon capture and storage in the US off the basis of that expertise that they've developed. So I'm not quite as, maybe I would say I'm more hopeful through experience in the industry developing and evolving.
Agreed. CCS is one counterexample, but it's still in the big picture good. I mean, so Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is working to implement carbon engineering's technology. And I think in a world with high carbon constraints, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures will keep doing better, and Mothership Oxy will gradually get smaller. That's the world. And then institutional investors will want them split. That's the way these things tend to happen.
We need to wrap this up. This is a really important conversation, and I want to thank you all for being here and giving us the opportunity to have a really good exchange around some of the issues that I think are at the core of figuring out answers to how there will be a move forward in efforts to reduce climate change and come up with policies that will be embraced not just by investors, but also by consumers. You raised a really good point about consumers. So thank you all very much for your perspectives today, and David for coming in by video. And I hope we'll have a chance to probe some of these issues again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.